They stuck me in the laundry room on Christmas while they laughed without me. No seat at the table, no gift with my name, just a folding chair and a cold floor. So I gave the house they expected to inherit to the neighbors who treated me like a human being. What happened next will shock you. But before we continue, hit that subscribe button for more stories like this. My name is Evelyn Hart, and I am 72 years old, though on Christmas morning, as I stood in the snow outside my son's house holding a tin of almond shortbread cookies, I felt ancient in a way no number could capture. The driveway was already packed. Tire tracks tangled like veins leading toward a heart I once believed still had room for me. I climbed the path slowly, careful on the ice, the cold biting through the soles of my boots and into my bones. But I still held onto the tin with both hands, the cookies arranged in perfect spirals, just like my mother taught me when I was a girl. The front door opened before I could knock, and there stood my daughter-in-law, her smile stretched too wide, like a bow tied too tight around something brittle. "We've got you all set up in the back room," she said, already turning before I could respond. I followed her past twinkling garlands and candle-scented wreaths, past framed family photos I had taken myself over the years, to a door near the laundry closet. She opened it with a cheerful swing and stepped aside like she was revealing a treasure, but inside was a folding chair, a humming space heater, and towers of storage bins labelled Xmas Decor and old clothes. "Sorry, we're bursting at the seams this year," she added, already retreating. I placed my tin on the edge of a wobbly table, still sticky with old tape, and shrugged off my coat, though I kept it draped around my shoulders like armor. I sat there, in that windowless room, the kind of place meant for cast-offs, not kin, and let the weight of that moment settle across my lap. Through the thin drywall I could hear my grandchildren laughing, the rip of wrapping paper, the clink of glasses, and not once did anyone wonder aloud where Grandma was. I had stitched stockings for each of those children, had tucked $20 bills and peppermint sticks into them, since the year each of them were born. And yet now, I was tucked away myself. Like a fragile ornament, nobody wanted to risk breaking. I stared at the heater, its coils glowing like tired embers, and I remembered the holidays I used to host, the meals I used to cook, the beds I used to make with lavender sachets tucked into the pillowcases. I had spent decades making everyone feel special. And now, I was just the woman in the broom closet. I didn't speak up. Not that day. I simply sat and absorbed the message they sent without words. And believe me, I heard every syllable. The wrapping paper flew like confetti as the children squealed and tore into gifts stacked higher than their heads, each box brighter and louder than the last. Ribbons snapping and bows tossed aside like afterthoughts in the frenzy. I stood near the archway with my tray of cookies, the ones I made every year without fail. Almond and raspberry thumbprints arranged in neat spirals on my mother's porcelain platter, the one with the faded violets around the rim. No one looked my way. No one offered to help set them down. I hovered there like a ghost, unsure whether to interrupt or disappear. Each name shouted with glee echoed like a little hammer in my chest. Ava, Liam, Sophie, all followed by tissue paper and thank yous, shouted in the direction of their parents. I waited for my name to be called. Even once. I waited for a card that said, Grandma, for a small box, maybe a candle, even a pair of gloves from the dollar store. But there was nothing. Not even a tag with my name on it. My daughter-in-law sat perched on the couch like a queen on Christmas morning, her hair curled, her lipstick perfect, while my son handed her a small velvet box and the room hushed. She opened it slowly, dramatically, and inside was a diamond necklace that shimmered with enough brilliance to pull gasps from every corner. She beamed, clutched her chest, and leaned in to kiss him with a polished intimacy that made me feel like a stranger in their lives. I smiled too, because it was the only thing I knew how to do when there was no safe place to rest my hands, no chair, no invitation to sit. Just me and my tray of untouched cookies, and a heart slowly collapsing under the weight of years I thought had meant something. I set the platter down on the kitchen counter, between an untouched fruitcake and a tray of shrimp cocktail, and retreated back toward the hallway, past the sound of laughter, past the smells of glazed ham and cinnamon cider, back to the room they had given me with the folding chair and the space heater that now hummed like a cruel lullaby. I sat alone, hands folded in my lap, wondering when I had stopped being someone they saw and started becoming a prop in their holiday tableau. No one came looking for me. No one even noticed I was gone. The dining table stretched long and shining, polished to perfection and dressed with holly-patterned china, but my seat was tucked awkwardly at the very end, where the linoleum floor of the kitchen began, a half-inch drop beneath the chair legs that made it wobble with every shift. I'm Evelyn Hart, 72 years old, and that night I sat where the heat from the oven could reach me but not the conversation. They had placed me there with a smile and a, "Hope you don't mind, this way we can all squeeze in," but the squeeze never seemed to touch anyone else. My view was of elbows and backs, and every time I tried to chime in with a memory or a gentle joke, my words hung in the air like snowflakes that melted before they ever landed. I told a story about the time my son had put glitter in the mashed potatoes when he was 5, and only the baby glanced up from her peas. The others were too busy swapping office gossip, vacation plans, and baby names to notice. At one point, I reached for the gravy boat and knocked a spoon off the counter, the clang echoing too loud, and still no one turned. I chewed my turkey quietly, even though the edges were dry and the cranberry sauce never made it my way. I had brought a bottle of wine, a decent one, tucked in a gift bag with a ribbon, but it remained unopened by the fridge while their sleek Cabernet flowed like water from stemmed glasses. From where I sat, I could see the recycling bin slowly filling with wrapping paper and laughter I hadn't been invited to share. My granddaughter Sophie reached for a second roll, and I offered her the butter, but she didn't hear me. I watched as my son leaned over to kiss his wife on the cheek, whispering something that made her giggle, her hand grazing the new diamond necklace that still caught the light like a taunt. I looked around that room, full of people who bore my blood, and felt the strange hollowness of being in the middle of a moment that used to belong to me. This wasn't about space or planning or being busy. This was about something unspoken and sharp, the slow erosion of significance. I wasn't a guest of honor anymore. I wasn't even a guest. I was just someone they had to accommodate, a chair to fill, a box to check. And I sat through that dinner, not with bitterness, but with the quiet clarity that only comes when you finally see what has been there all along. When I got back home that night, long after the last dish had been scraped clean and the last laughter had faded behind me, I stood in the doorway of my house with the porch light still on, casting a familiar glow on the welcome mat that hadn't seen a true guest in years. I'm Evelyn Hart, 72, and as I closed the door behind me and set my purse down, I looked around at the life I had built from the ground up, room by room, inch by inch, breath by breath. This house was never just wood and nails. It was where I carried groceries in with a baby on my hip, where I patched the roof myself one summer when money was tight, where every lamp and tile had been chosen, not for trend or bragging rights, but because it fit the rhythm of our life. The living room still held the couch my son had jumped on when he was 5 and chipped his tooth. The kitchen table had a dent from the time I dropped a frozen turkey the first Christmas after my husband died. I had worked extra shifts to afford the new furnace, painted the walls by hand when they needed a fresh start, and kept every tax receipt in a folder labeled just in case. I walked slowly through the hallway, Past photos in frames I dust weekly, even if no one looks at them anymore. My son's graduation, my late husband in his navy uniform, Sophie's first steps captured in a blur of curls and joy. And yet, after all this, after decades of holding everyone else up, I had been tucked into a corner and treated like an obligation. I once thought I would leave this house to him, that it would be the foundation of their future, a place of roots and gratitude. But walking through it now, in my silence, I could feel every sacrifice they no longer remembered. Every birthday I paid for, every scraped knee I kissed, every second-hand coat I cleaned and patched, so they would never feel the cold. This house had held a family, but it no longer felt like anyone belonged to it, except me. And for the first time in my life, I realized I didn't have to give it to someone who no longer saw its worth, or mine. It was nearly 8 the next evening when the knock came, light and respectful, not urgent but present, like a small reminder that not every door leads to disappointment. I had just finished folding the same blanket I had once used to swaddle my son, the one I kept at the foot of the couch more out of habit than need, when I opened the door and found Rosa Mendoza, standing there with a foil-covered tray in her hands, and her husband Miguel behind her, holding a second one. "We made too much," she said with a sheepish smile, even though we both knew that wasn't the reason. The aroma of roasted pork, saffron rice, and fresh cilantro hit me like a memory I never knew I missed. I'm Evelyn Hart, 72, and it's been years since someone brought me food without it being part of a holiday obligation or a potluck exchange. I ushered them in, insisting they didn't have to take off their shoes, but they did anyway. Their teenage son, Daniel, appeared not long after, his hoodie half-zipped and hair still wet from a shower, asking if he could fix the flickering porch light. "I noticed it last night," he said, already pulling tools from a backpack that looked more like it belonged to a college student than a high school junior. I stood there, not knowing what to say, hands still damp from rinsing a mug. No one had offered to fix anything around here since my husband passed. No one had even noticed what needed tending. Rosa set the trays on the counter like it was her kitchen, not out of presumption but out of comfort, as if she understood the rhythm of a space without needing permission. Miguel asked how I was feeling, really feeling, in a way that cracked something open inside me. We sat in the kitchen for an hour, talking about nothing and everything, while Daniel screwed in a new bulb and checked the wiring, his laughter spilling through the open window as he waved at his dad through the glass. When they left, they didn't ask for containers back or hint at favors owed. They simply said, "Merry Christmas," and meant it. I closed the door and leaned against it for a long while, the flan still warm in my hands, and felt something I hadn't in years seen. Not needed, not tolerated, just gently, generously, undeniably seen. The office was colder than I remembered. All frosted glass and waiting room silence, the kind of sterile quiet that made pens scratch louder and chairs creak with meaning. I sat there in my wool coat, buttoned all the way to the top even though it was too warm inside, hands folded neatly over my lap like I was back in Sunday service waiting for the benediction. When Mr. Langley finally called me in, he didn't ask why I was there, just smiled that small, professional smile of someone who knew better than to ask personal questions. "I'm Evelyn Hart, 72 years old, and I didn't come here to make a scene or to settle scores. I came with a folder of documents I had reviewed twice already, and a heart clear enough to finally move the pen in the right direction." We sat across from each other at a broad oak desk, while I slid the papers forward and told him what I wanted changed. "Remove my son from the deed," I said, "and revise the will to reflect a new beneficiary." He blinked once, maybe twice, but didn't interrupt. I spelled the names slowly, carefully, Rosa and Miguel Mendoza, and explained that the house would pass to them upon my death, along with the contents and any remaining financial accounts tied to the property. "Are you sure?" he asked gently, like I had wandered in confused. and I nodded before the breath had even left his lips. This wasn't about revenge. This wasn't about bitterness. This was about directing the fruits of my labor to people who had shown kindness without conditions, whose son fixed a porch light without expecting payment, who brought food with smiles and stories, not pity. I signed each page with steady hands. No hesitation. No flinch. Just the deliberate grace of a woman who had spent decades being careful with everyone but herself. As the final signature dried, I felt something loosen inside me, like a knot finally giving way after years of pulling tight. Mr. Langley stood to shake my hand, but I didn't need the formality. I already knew what I had done. I had rerouted my legacy, redirected the river after it dried up in its old bed, and poured it into soil that could still bloom. I left the office without fanfare, stepped into the winter light with my coat still buttoned, and for the first time in years, I walked home not burdened by family, but lifted by clarity. The box was heavier than I remembered. The one labelled Xmas in fading red marker, tucked in the back of the closet, like an afterthought that still managed to tug at memory every December. I dragged it to the coffee table, careful not to tear the edges, and lifted the lid with the reverence of someone opening a time capsule. Inside were the trimmings of holidays past, wrapped in tissue that had yellowed with age, each piece a relic of joy that once felt simple. I'm Evelyn Hart, 72 years old, and I used to decorate this house with laughter in the background and flour on my apron, with Bing Crosby playing and my son weaving garland like it was a game. But this time, the house was quiet as I unwrapped each item, alone but not surprised. Near the bottom, nestled between tangled lights and a bent felt reindeer, I found it the old clay ornament shaped like a star, painted messily in gold and green. My son's name carved into the back with the shaky scrawl of a 6-year-old. I had kept it all these years, even after the paint chipped and the edges dulled. I cupped it in my hand, thumb brushing the flaked corner, and for a moment I was back in that kindergarten classroom, watching him beam as he handed it to me, sticky fingers and all. But now, decades later, I held it differently. It was cracked through the center, a clean fracture running from one point to the next, like a warning or a truth finally splitting through. I sat there with it for a long while, heart heavier than the box, eyes tracing the break that mirrored the quiet distance we never talked about. This wasn't just a broken ornament. It was a symbol of all the small things I had held onto long after they stopped being held back. I stood slowly, crossed to the kitchen, and placed it gently in the trash, not with anger, not even with sadness, but with the same kind of quiet resolve I had carried into the lawyer's office. Some things are too broken to repair, and some memories, sweet as they once were, do not belong in a house that is finally breathing in new light. I closed the lid on the box and the past, both tucked away now, both a little lighter than before. The call came on a Tuesday afternoon, crisp and unassuming, just after I had come in from pruning the hydrangeas that never quite survived the frost. The ringtone buzzed across the kitchen counter, and when I saw her name flash across the screen, I almost let it go to voicemail. But curiosity got the better of me, or maybe habit did, and I answered with a simple hello, already bracing myself. I'm Evelyn Hart, 72 years old, and I've learned that some conversations wear a smile like a mask, all sugar and silk, but stitched from motives that have nothing to do with love. Hi, Evelyn. My daughter-in-law chirped, her voice carefully casual. The same tone she used when asking me to watch the kids last minute or bring a dish to the dinner I hadn't actually been invited to. Hope you're staying warm, she said, then launched straight into it, as if we'd spoken just yesterday. I was wondering if you finalized everything with the estate stuff, for tax purposes. My accountant says it's best to plan early. I didn't flinch. I didn't blink. I just stirred my tea with slow circles, watching the steam curl like secrets in the air. It's all taken care of, I said, even and calm, as though the paperwork hadn't been shifted weeks ago, as though her name hadn't been quietly erased from every line that once linked her to this house. She paused, the silence on her end thick enough to hear her smile falter. "Oh, good," she replied too brightly. "Just wanted to make sure everything was in place. You know how things can get complicated." I nodded, though she couldn't see, and said nothing else. Let her sit with that. Let her wonder what taken care of meant. Let her comb through that phrase for answers she wouldn't find. I didn't owe her the comfort of clarification. Not after folding chairs and empty stockings. Not after being treated like an afterthought in the very life I had once built to hold them. After we hung up, I went back to my pruning, shears snipping away the brittle remnants of last season, making space for what might bloom next. There was no anger in me, just certainty. Some calls are made to take, some calls are made to give, and this one was made to find out if the well still flowed. And now, she knew it didn't. It started in the back pews, as most things do, where the whispers run faster than the offertory basket and judgment always arrives before the closing hymn. I had just sat down in my usual spot at St. Can. Agnes, 2 rows from the back near the stained glass window that throws light across the floor like God himself was stitching gold into stone, when I felt it begin. A nudge, a glance, a not-so-quiet murmur behind a prayer book. I'm Evelyn Hart, 72 years old, and this church has held my joys, my grief, and my secrets longer than most people have held my hand. I kept my eyes on the altar, lips moving in practiced rhythm, but my ears caught the flicker of phrases I knew were about me. Gifting the house, one voice whispered. Not to her own blood, another replied, almost scandalized. To the Mendozas, if you can believe it. I could almost feel their heads turn like sunflowers toward gossip. And for a moment, the old version of me stirred, the one who would have politely corrected them, smoothed over the rough edges, with a kind smile and an explanation soaked in grace. But not today. Today, I said nothing. I clasped my hands together and let the words roll past me like rain on a roof that had already been sealed. Let them guess. Let them speculate. Let them gather like hens pecking at the corners of a story they will never fully know. I did not stand up to defend myself because I finally understood something I did not owe these people an explanation for choosing kindness over bloodline, for giving warmth where it was returned, for rewriting a legacy with open eyes. The Mendozas had done what family should do without being asked. They had shown up, again and again, without condition or fanfare, just presence. That was more than anyone whispering behind me ever had. As the final hymn swelled and the congregation stood, I rose with them, spine straight and shoulders relaxed. I did not turn around. I did not search their faces for judgment or approval. I walked out into the winter morning with my coat buttoned and my head high, the bells tolling above me like a benediction no one could take away. Let them talk. Let them wonder. My silence this time was not surrender. It was sovereignty. The scent of cinnamon and vanilla drifted through my kitchen as I set the flan on the table, the same one the Mendozas had brought me the week after Christmas. Still warm from their oven and wrapped in kindness, I hadn't realized I had been starving for. Now I had baked one myself, not as a return gesture, but as an offering, a symbol that not all gifts need to be wrapped in ribbon or bloodlines. I'm Evelyn Hart, 72, and this home has known decades of birthdays and funerals, laughter in the hallway and fights behind closed doors. But today it would witness something quieter and far more sacred: gratitude. When the Mendozas arrived, the teenage boy holding a bouquet of carnations and Mrs. Mendoza's eyes already shining, I welcomed them in without preamble, just open arms and a table set for tea. They were nervous at first, sensing there was something more than just dessert between us, and when we sat, I slid the paperwork across the table like it was a tray of truth. Mr. Mendoza stared at the documents, then at me, his mouth opening without words, while Mrs. Mendoza's hand flew to her mouth, trembling, her eyes filling so quickly it made my chest ache. I am leaving the house to you, I said gently, folding my hands like I was in church again. Everything is filed, witnessed, and signed. All I ask is that you treat it with the care you've always shown me. There was silence at first, not the uncomfortable kind, but the kind that falls when something holy happens in a room, like everyone senses the weight of it, and no one dares to speak too quickly. Then Mrs. Mendoza began to cry. Not loudly, but deeply, her shoulders shaking as her husband placed a hand on hers. "We don't know what to say," he whispered, still stunned. "You don't have to say anything," I replied, my voice softer than I expected. "You made me feel like a person again, not a burden, not a footnote, just Evelyn." I smiled, not for show, but from someplace honest that had been locked away for far too long. We ate in that sunlit kitchen, a family not born but built from moments of grace, passing flan and stories like old friends, the scent of forgiveness warming the air. In that moment, I knew I had made the right decision, not because of what I gave, but because of what I had finally received. Respect, warmth, and a place at my own table. He came without calling, without warning, the way storms roll in after a long drought, all noise and heat with no regard for the ground beneath them. I saw him through the front window, pacing on the porch, with that tight-lipped tension I remembered from when he was a boy who couldn't find his baseball glove. Except now the stakes were different, and his anger had nothing to do with games. I opened the door before he could knock, already knowing what was coming, already braced for it. "How could you give away what's ours?" he snapped, voice sharp enough to slice the winter air. He didn't say hello, didn't ask how I'd been, just pushed past me into the hallway like he still had some unspoken right to walk wherever he pleased. "I'm Evelyn Hart, 72, and this house may have held his childhood, but it was built with my hands, my savings, my quiet sacrifices stacked like bricks no one ever saw." He stood in the living room, eyes bouncing from framed photos to furniture, like the house itself had betrayed him. "This is the family home," he said, gesturing wide, like he was summoning ghosts. "You had no right to just give it away." I looked at him, really looked at him. The man who used to bring me dandelions in chubby fists, now grown into someone who could stick his mother in a storage closet on Christmas and not blink. "It stopped being yours," I said slowly, my voice steady but not cold. "The day you put me in the laundry room like a suitcase you didn't know where to store." He flinched then, whether from guilt or recognition I couldn't tell. The silence that followed was long, stretching between us like a drawbridge that had finally snapped. "You're being emotional," he muttered, which used to work on me, used to send me second-guessing every decision. "Not anymore." "No," I said. "I'm being clear." He tried again, softer now, asking if I had really thought this through, if I knew what this meant for the family. "Family?" I echoed. "You mean the people who left me in a folding chair beside a water heater while they toasted with champagne?" He had no answer. And I didn't need one. I showed him the door, not angrily, just firmly. And when it closed behind him, I felt something lift off me. Something heavy I hadn't known I'd still been carrying. I stood in the quiet and let it settle. This house is no longer his inheritance. It's my liberation. He came back 3 days later, this time with a manila folder tucked under his arm and a new tightness in his jaw that told me he had spoken to a lawyer. The way he crossed the threshold, eyes scanning the walls like he was inventorying loss, made it clear he hadn't come for a conversation. He came to intimidate, to rattle the foundations he once assumed were his by birthright. I sat at the kitchen table, the same one where I had bandaged his knees and cooled his fevers, and waited for him to speak. "We'll contest it," he said flatly, dropping the folder on the table like a gauntlet. "The house, the will. You're not thinking clearly. This is just a phase. You're upset." I looked up from my tea, steady as a lighthouse in a storm. "I'm Evelyn Hart," I said calmly, 72 years old and sharper now than I've ever been. "Don't mistake my age for confusion." He leaned forward, voice low, like he thought volume gave weight to empty threats. "You're giving away the family legacy to strangers." I didn't raise my voice. I didn't flinch. I simply reached for the drawer beside me and slid out a thick envelope, handing it to him with 2 fingers and a small nod. "That is a notarized copy of the will," I said. "Reviewed by 2 attorneys and filed properly. There's nothing for you to contest." He stared at it like it was a betrayal, etched in ink. Then back at me. "You're doing this to punish us." I finally smiled then, not cruelly, but with the quiet grace of someone who has nothing left to prove. "This isn't revenge," I said softly. "It's recognition of who saw me and who didn't." His mouth opened, but nothing came out. He sat down across from me, the bravado leaking out of him like steam from a cracked pipe. "You never said anything," he whispered. "And when I did," I replied, "no one listened." We sat there in the hum of the kitchen, years of misunderstanding settling like dust between us. He folded the envelope slowly, tucked it under his arm, and stood. "I guess that's it then?" I nodded once. "Yes, it is." And when the door clicked shut behind him, I didn't cry. I didn't rage. I simply sipped my tea, the warmth spreading through my chest like a fire that didn't burn. Just a steady heat that said I was finally seen. The house had always been too quiet after the holidays, but this year the silence felt different, not hollow but intentional, like the pause after a final word spoken with certainty. I moved room by room with a sense of calm purpose, opening drawers, lifting lids, unfolding the past one memory at a time. My name is Evelyn Hart, 72 years old, and I was not packing to leave in a rush. I was curating what stayed behind. The crystal candy dish my mother gave me at my wedding went into a padded box for the community library, where children would now drop peppermints into its gleaming belly. The quilt I spent one whole winter stitching by hand, each square a season of my life, would go to the women's shelter where someone in need could wrap themselves in more than just fabric, but in the belief that comfort still existed. My son had once said these things would be his someday, and I had believed that too. But now I saw how quickly gratitude could turn into entitlement, how memories could be polished into bargaining chips. I donated the antique clock from the mantel to the Historical Society and left a note inside the back panel, detailing how my late husband had once rewired it with bent coat hangers because we couldn't afford a repairman. I gave the lace doilies to the church thrift shop, wrapped in lavender-scented tissue, and I smiled knowing some other woman's hands would set them under vases and lamps, not knowing whose stories they carried, but keeping them safe just the same. I kept a few pieces, of course. The ceramic robin from the kitchen window, the photo of my daughter before she moved away, and the old yellow apron with the sunflowers faded almost invisible. Everything else found new homes with people and places that might not have my name, but had earned my respect. I did not move with sadness. I moved with release. Each box sealed was a promise that my legacy would live where it was welcomed, not hoarded behind closed doors by people who once turned their backs on me for convenience. As I labelled the final tote, I looked around the home that had once echoed with footsteps and arguments and songs from the radio while I made stew. And now, in the quiet, I felt a peace that came not from stillness but from clarity. This was not the end. It was a choosing. And for once, every piece of me was being given to hands that would truly hold it. The morning of my 73rd birthday arrived without fuss or fanfare. Just the quiet shuffle of slippers on hardwood and the scent of strong coffee brewing in the kitchen I had once painted robin's egg blue. There were no balloons, no cards from my son, not even a perfunctory call to mark the day. But there was a velvet box on the counter, not for me, but from me, holding a brass key that had opened the front door of this house for more than 4 decades. I placed it gently in my coat pocket, smoothed down my sweater, and stepped outside into the crisp spring air. The garden was in bloom, the daffodils nodding, as if they knew the moment had finally come. I walked the short path next door where laughter spilled from the Mendoza kitchen like sunlight through open blinds. When they answered the door, all 3 of them were still in pajamas, blinking with surprise. "Happy birthday," Mrs. Mendoza gasped, her hand flying to her mouth when she saw the key. I held it out with both hands and said simply, "This is your house now." They stared at me like I had just handed them the moon. Their son, 16 and lanky with kindness in his eyes, wrapped his arms around me in a hug that landed deep in my ribs. I hadn't been hugged like that in years, not since before I became an obligation instead of a welcome guest. "Mr." Mendoza tried to speak but couldn't, and instead just took the key as if it might vanish if he blinked too hard. I smiled and added, "You can repaint the shutters, replace the carpets, make it yours, but keep the daffodils. They're mine." "Mrs." Mendoza nodded through tears, whispering promises about how the house would never be anything but sacred. I believed her. I saw the way she folded laundry with care, how she waved to every neighbor, how her eyes never dimmed when someone else was speaking. I trusted her to love the bones of this place the way I had, not for its roof or walls, but for the lives it held. As I turned to leave, I felt no weight in my chest, no regret hitching a ride on my breath. I was not losing a home. I was planting it, like those daffodils, into soil that would nourish it with gratitude and laughter and warmth. For the first time in years, I felt celebrated, not with cake or gifts, but with the quiet knowing that I had finally given my love somewhere it would bloom. The first morning in the cottage began with light that didn't ask permission, just strolled in through the wide window and stretched itself across the old patchwork quilt I had folded and refolded for years, but never really slept under. It was golden and warm, the kind of light that finds your cheek before your eyes even open, and I lay there still, listening to the quiet tick of a second-hand clock and the gentle lap of lake water not far from my door. The cottage was small. Yes, just 2 rooms and a little porch, but it was enough, more than enough, because every part of it was mine. No storage bins pushed against the wall, no folding chairs to perch on while conversations and laughter took place in rooms I was no longer welcome in. There was no one else's chaos shoved behind doors, no coat racks buried in seasonal clutter. Just a space I had chosen with intention, with care, with the kind of love I used to give out like candy at Christmas, until I realized not everyone deserved the sweetness. The walls here were painted soft blue, like morning skies, and I had hung only 3 pictures my wedding day, my children as babies, and a photo I had taken of the lake the first time I visited. I brewed tea on the tiny stove and watched a pair of ducks skim across the water as if they were showing off, and I smiled. Not because everything had gone perfectly in my life, but because I had finally chosen myself without apology. There were no more corners to be shoved into, no more holidays spent in laundry rooms while others toasted around glittering tables. Here, the table was round, wooden, worn from years of hands and stories, and it only seated 2, Just enough for a neighbour or a friend, but never again for someone who mistook my presence for inconvenience. I sat in the armchair by the window with my tea, my legs wrapped in the very quilt that had once rested at the foot of a bed I shared with a man who had built this peace with me, brick by brick, memory by memory. He was gone now, but the silence he left behind was soft, not empty. And as the sun climbed higher, painting streaks of light across the floor, I exhaled, not with sadness, but with certainty. I had found the room with the window, the one no one gave me, the one I made myself.